Hello, this is SGD, and this will be part 4 of a series looking at the Omphalos, or the Umbilicus, or navel stones, or Benben stones as they are called. And previously, so of course, links in the description, and the connections to these very specific, important places featuring these very important stones, but also how it connects to the Great Pyramid. And we'll come to this because Heliopolis, the city of the sun, a sun temple, but also, well, this will connect, but in this particular episode, so anyway, okay, we're looking at these places as centers of power, centers of the earth, and how these all important stones, both in the ancient and the modern world, for instance, London and New York, connect, and how this concept can, or the omphalos, which is navel, or the belly button, umbilicus cord, and well, some very interesting historical connections, and they feature these. But we're going into more. But in this episode, so just a review, especially the Omphalos at Delphi being this very important one, not the most important, actually the Benben stones, Nefertiti, Akhenaten, but Heliopolis and Atun-Ra, the sun gods, but the navel stone, the center of creation, primal mounds. Now, I'll also put a link in the description to Ninth Heretic, who's been looking into Africa and South America and some other places off the stone building map, but their use of primordial mounds, because whether it's the Benben stone or this Omphalos, this is a primordial mound, a center of creation, a center of the world, which has so much to do with the emergence of the water, from the earth from the waters, which is also a familiar theme in Genesis. From the waters these things emerge. Now, in this particular episode, I want to be focused on the East. And by that I mean, so this has been centered around the Mediterranean and Europe, but now I want to go over to places such as Taxila or Sirkap, Sanchi Stupa, as well as Borobudur temple in Indonesia, and how these have the same themes running through them. There's a focus on, like Sumer doesn't really get enough attention, even though the advanced maths that were there. Egypt seems to be the center. Well, it sort of is, but what we see is actually a long historical tradition across the globe. And so, in Taxila or Sirkap, which is this very important place. Now, this is part of the Kushan Empire, Bactria, and it has a lot to do, as we'll see in a moment, the transfer of influences between certain cultures. So, for instance, the Greek and Roman world were the recipients of knowledge from Egypt, from the the twin rivers, Mesopotamia, Persia, also from the Far East and through India. Now, for instance, the Romans had a port down here, and they did a lot of trade with it, huge amounts of trade with India. So where there's a trade of goods, there's also a trade of knowledge, but this trade from east to west extends quite a long way back. Well recorded, spoken about, for instance, in the Greco-Roman era, but there's a lot of weights and measures evidence to show that, especially Mohenjo-Daro, which would be not too far south of Sirk, so along the Indus River, and, well, weights and measures, ancient trade. When you trade goods, you trade knowledge, and this has been a thing. But Sirkap, Stupa, Taxila, we also have this regular theme. So here we have a stupa, but that's the term most applied, but the connections to especially Greco-Buddhist architecture. So, for instance, when Alexander moved through there, he introduced a lot of will become Roman, but Greek architectural themes. So though it's mostly destroyed, we still have bits and pieces and descriptions of these, and this is an important theme. Now, what do you see? What have we got here? Temple of Apollo at Delphi, the Omphalos. Now, the legend of the Omphalos at the Temple of Delphi in Apollo was that Zeus sent out two birds opposite directions of the world to find the center or the navel of the world, the belly button of the world. The eagles met over the temple of Apollo at Delphi, and so he cast down this stone from like a world creation stone, just similar as in Benben and others, where the primordial mound emerges, where the first earth emerges. So, for instance, in Genesis, the earth arose from the waters. But in Sirkap, what we also, well, we have many themes, but we have the double-headed eagle, which is, again, it's an important alchemical theme, and others. But this is part of something called Greco-Buddhist architecture. So also at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, we have the Dancers of Delphi, this column, or it's also known as the Acanthus column. Here we have a Corinthian column, which was a final form emerged, but it's based on the Acanthus leaf. We also have Corinthian columns in Sirkap. Now it's part of Greco-Buddhist architecture. Now the same theme of this Omphalos, especially on the Acanthus column or the Corinthian column, because the Omphalos there were two, there was one on the outside, which is a simpler form at the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, but we also have this form, which was on top of the Dancers of Delphi column, which is, or the Acanthus column, and we see the same themes here in the east. Now, you can contact the Hysteria channel, but like I'm not making this up. This guy and his shameless buddies like say that this is an ancient alien device of encoding the double helix. That's an actual double helix. Here's another Omphalos from the Vinca culture in Bulgaria, Serbia, going back quite some time, and we see the crosshatch element. Now that's an important one because the geometry of this absolutely rules out this guy, is a fraud and a shameless, and History Channel, who promotes this, should hang their heads in shame and jump off a bridge, frankly. But the Kushan Empire, so we had the Roman Empire, Parthia, like also Persia, and it's not well known, but we had this, which emerged and was around for quite a long time, the Kushan Empire. There we see a map. So this was Afghanistan, current day Pakistan, and this very important empire, which was a meeting place between the East and the West. Here we see one of their coins, Bactria, is also referred to now Afghanistan, where we have Heracles and the cornucopia. Cornucopia, very important. I'll put the link in the description. I did a series on the cornucopia. Now, Temple of Olympian Zeus in Athens. What we have is this is the first true Corinthian column, not the first Corinthians columns, but the first true Corinthian column. And we can see the influence of this. So in Bactria, Gandhara, what we have is Buddhist sculptures based on this Corinthian column design. There we get another example. This is what's called Greco-Buddhist architecture. And there is yet another example, again with Acanthus Sirkap temple. Also we have Atlas holding up the world, this transfer. There you see, that's that famous image of Atlas. Now also the cornucopia. Here we see clearly Eastern, and again holding the cornucopia, which is this important theme. I'll put the link in the description, but it's let's just say Masons, for instance, now especially continue this tradition onwards. Cornucopia, there we see again. So Gandhara, Bactria, this Kushan, very little spoken of empire, but let's look at how it's connected to Sanchi Stupa in what's this? North central India, Sanchi Stupa, which is also a repository of this ancient, well, it's astronomical archaeoastronomy connections, and again this reference to the stupa and the references to the Omphalos, but also we see connections between the East and the West. For instance, what we see is Greek Phrygian cap and also Greek musical instruments, so that's to commemorate the opening. So we see again travel and trade much more connected, much older than what most history would like to admit. There's this thing that they all developed individually, but again we see the griffins, griffonics, being a constant theme, still to this day used in esoteric architecture, for instance here in Sydney. And this as well can be, well, it's a in the Roman world. So this one here in Sydney Library, based on the temple of Antonius and Faustina, and, well, what's there in the centre? I can't for scrolling once again. But now let's go to Indonesia, Borobudur, way over here, and again we see this connection. Now I'll put a link in the description to a playlist where I went into the connections again. So we have a mandala and a stupa in the center once more. Now here's another example of a mandala. Consider the Omphalos, the navel stone, the center of the world. It's centered on the navel. Now this connects to a very ancient, Vitruvian man as drawn by Da Vinci, based on the Roman architect Vitruvius. Protagoras, man is a measure of all things. Much of what Vitruvius got was Greek, and the Greeks got their knowledge from other earlier civilizations. Now that same concept of the navel, or the Omphalos, the Umbilicus, or the Benben stone, the center of the world, being the center of man, man being the temple plan. Now, for instance, the chakras, where we see the navel, again being a reference to this tradition. Now, omphaloskepsis, navel gazing, was an ancient Greek form of meditation. Now it's a bad word, but it was an ancient Greek form of meditation. Here we see, again, this transfer of knowledge. The Greeks were considering converting to Buddhism. And you see that in Pythagorean schools, the connections, Eastern religion, reincarnation, for instance, being so important a concept in the Pythagorean traditions. Let no one who is ignorant of geometry enter my door. But we also see that alchemists would use, again, these same themes to encode some of their mathematical and alchemical knowledge as well. Because if you're reading, whether it's the Kabbalah or these older texts, what you actually find is on the top layer you have this, let's say, for the profane, but if you dig down a little bit deeper, there's math and science concealed there underneath for the initiates. Know thyself. The Vastu Shastra is an ancient, very, very ancient form of architecture which goes to the Hindu and the Vedic traditions. And this is one example of it, and the 9 square plan. I'll try to remember to put that link in that description as well, because it's still being used in the West today by these very important architects, town planners. But we have the 9 square plan with the sun at the center. So these are the 7 planets, which are also converting to the 7 heavenly bodies, the 7 elements, plus 2 extra moons, a waxing and waning moon. But we have, again, the 7 elements connected to, well, alchemy, hidden in plain sight. But this connects to the mandala, because again we have the 9 square plan, and with the sun at the center, and of course the navel at the center. Man is the measure of all things in this temple architecture, temple plans, which has been transferred into a more Western way, but again it's very ancient, very Eastern. But the math and the architecture can't be lost in translation. The spiritual, symbolic things can get lost. Language change in one generation. The meaning of words and the way we phrase things can change very quickly, but certain things remain true, and that especially being geometry and math. Now the lingam, important thing in Hindu temples, lingams are at the center. Now they'll pour milk, but there's also an important water ritual, cleansing the lingam, Shiva lingam. But in Athens, it was recently uncovered an omphalos there connected to a well. Wherever there is an omphalos, there is a well connected to it, because again there's a ritual basis in there, and water and fire, because this represents fire as well, the sun. So again, the sun at the center of the temple connected to a water cleansing ritual. And this will link to the Benben stone, the original Benben stone. Later they become represented as obelisks. But what we have is the original one. Notice the 2 birds and the snakes here. And the Bennu, or the phoenix, the firebird as well. But the connections to the sun and these other themes, which join all these cultures together in a beautiful, beautiful way. And so more to come, but for instance, the temple of Apollo, the sun god, at where we have these Omphalos famous ones at Delphi, we have the sun and the Vastu Shastra, ancient Hindu Buddhist traditions, as well as the Benben stone, Heliopolis, Sun City, the temple of Ra Atun, the sun.